In 1939, as Europe spiraled toward a conflict unlike anything the world had ever witnessed, Germany's military planners viewed Canada not as a future adversary, but as a geopolitical footnote, a distant dominion of the British Empire with a microscopic professional army, limited industrial capacity, and no independent military legacy comparable to the great powers rising around it. German intelligence records from the late 1930s openly dismissed Canada as a secondary auxiliary, expecting nothing more than symbolic participation, small detachments integrated into British units, and minimal strategic effect on the war's outcome. When Canada declared war on Germany on September 10, 1939, 7 days after Britain, the reaction inside the Wehrmacht was a mixture of indifference and skepticism. To the German General Staff, this was a predictable political gesture, a loyal dominion following its imperial center into conflict. What the Wehrmacht failed to grasp, and what this documentary reveals, is how this supposedly insignificant force would evolve into one of the most lethal, resilient, and strategically indispensable Allied armies of the entire European campaign. Canada entered the war with just 4,500 regular soldiers, fewer than many German regiments. Its armored corps barely existed, its air force was small, and its navy possessed a handful of destroyers. Yet beneath this modest exterior lay something Germany catastrophically underestimated: a rapidly industrializing nation, a population willing to mobilize on a scale far exceeding expectations, and political leadership determined to transform Canada from a minor participant into a decisive military actor. Within the first 2 years of war, 730,000 Canadians volunteered, an extraordinary figure for a nation of only 11 million. Training camps expanded across the country, new military bases appeared seemingly overnight, and what had once been a tiny army began constructing the foundation for a modern combined arms fighting force. German analysts, trapped in pre-war assumptions, failed to recognize this transformation in real time. By 1941, as the Wehrmacht rampaged across the Soviet Union and dominated continental Europe, the Canadians were already undergoing rigorous training, adopting British doctrinal experience, developing specialized engineer units, and constructing an artillery arm renowned for precision and discipline. At the same time, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, run primarily in Canada, began producing tens of thousands of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and aircrew for the Allied war effort. German commanders knew the plan existed, but they failed to understand the scale. More than 130,000 trained airmen would pass through Canada, making it the single largest aviation training system in human history. This was not the footprint of a minor auxiliary. It was the infrastructure of a rising military power. Yet the early war years were a mixed crucible of tragedy and hard lessons. In December 1941, Canada deployed 2 battalions to Hong Kong, where they faced overwhelming Japanese forces. The result was catastrophic. The units were destroyed, suffering 290 killed and 493 wounded. Survivors were subjected to horrific conditions in POW camps. For many Canadians, Hong Kong became a symbol of sacrifice, grief, and the brutal realities of global war. But for their army, it was a catalyst. The lessons learned, lack of preparedness, insufficient intelligence, inadequate support, ignited reforms in training, command, and combat doctrine. German strategists saw only defeat. They did not see the transformation occurring beneath the surface. The 1942 Dieppe raid was another turning point, disastrous for the Canadian forces involved, who suffered nearly 60% casualties in a single day. German coastal defenses, intelligence superiority, and prepared positions turned the Allied raid into chaos. German commanders interpreted the failure as confirmation of Canadian incompetence. In reality, Dieppe became one of the most studied operations of the entire war. The hard-earned insights, beach obstacles, need for specialized armor, importance of pre-landing bombardment, coordination between naval, air, and ground forces directly shaped the planning for D-Day. Canadian engineers who survived Dieppe became instrumental in creating the armored vehicles that would eventually smash through German defenses on June 6, 1944. Germany mistook Dieppe for weakness. It was actually the foundation of Canadian dominance. Meanwhile, in Sicily and Italy during 1943, Canadian formations began proving themselves as elite infantry, enduring harsh terrain, blistering heat, and relentless German counterattacks. The Battle of Ortona, often called Little Stalingrad, became a defining moment. Canadian soldiers fought house to house against veteran German paratroopers in some of the most brutal urban combat of the war. Casualties approached 25%, but the Canadians refused to break. They innovated mouse-holing, blasting holes through buildings to move between structures without entering exposed streets. This tactic would later be taught in military academies worldwide. German diaries from paratroopers in Ortona described the Canadians as ferocious, impossible to dislodge, and indifferent to suffering. The myth of the small auxiliary army was already collapsing, but the Wehrmacht had not yet realized it. By early 1944, Canada had become one of the largest military contributors in Western Europe, fielding entire divisions supported by armor, artillery, engineers, logistics, and air assets. When planning began for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, the Canadians were assigned Juno Beach, one of the most heavily fortified sectors of the Atlantic Wall. German commanders believed that the Canadians, with their reputation as inexperienced colonials, would break under fire. They were disastrously wrong. On June 6, 1944, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division landed on Juno Beach under savage German machine gun fire, artillery bombardments, and coastal defenses designed to annihilate assaulting forces. The initial landing waves suffered devastating casualties, exceeding 50% in some companies. Yet unlike other beaches, where Allied troops took hours to exit the killing zones, the Canadians pushed inland with relentless momentum. By noon, they had achieved the deepest penetration of any Allied landing force, more than 9 kilometers into German-held territory. They captured strategically vital villages, destroyed armored counterattacks, and secured critical junctions that later enabled the British and Canadians to launch assaults toward Caen. German units defending Juno were shattered, losing more than 1,000 men in the first hours alone. This was not the performance of a small army. This was the emergence of one of the Allies' most lethal strike formations. As the smoke of Juno Beach lifted and the scale of the Canadian breakthrough became undeniable, German field commanders sent frantic reports back to Army Group B, describing an adversary vastly different from the one they had expected. These were not the inexperienced auxiliaries they had been told to anticipate, but hardened, methodical, relentless infantry, supported by precise artillery, well-coordinated engineering units, and armored formations moving with a confidence that shocked even veteran Wehrmacht officers. Canadian forward elements pressed toward Carpiquet airfield, one of the most strategically important objectives of the Normandy campaign, and began a brutal series of engagements that stunned the German 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. German interrogations of captured Canadians revealed a level of training, discipline, and technical understanding completely inconsistent with pre-invasion intelligence. The myth of the small army continued to unravel. But to understand why these troops were so effective in 1944, one must look to the years preceding D-Day, when Canada, anticipating the coming storm, engineered one of the most rigorous training systems in the Allied world. Under the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, the skies over Canada became the vast classroom for Allied air power. Dozens of airfields, ranges, and technical schools sprang up across prairie farmland. Instructors from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada trained pilots, navigators, gunners, and bombardiers at a pace unmatched anywhere else. Simultaneously on the ground, Canada constructed massive infantry training centers designed to simulate European terrain. Recruits endured bitter winters in full kit, amphibious assault drills, and close-quarters combat training that emphasized aggression, initiative, and adaptability. Canadian engineers constructed mock German defensive networks to rehearse assaults on fortifications. Artillery units practiced coordinated fire missions with precision that mirrored British Royal Artillery doctrine, but with Canadian flexibility and speed. It was a crucible in which discipline fused with creativity. In the Mediterranean, Canadian formations were blooded in Sicily and Italy, where they confronted some of the toughest German defensive lines in the European theater. The Sicilian campaign forced Canadians to fight across mountains, dry riverbeds, and fortified towns, terrain perfect for German delaying tactics. The Canadians adapted quickly, using combined arms coordination to force German withdrawals again and again. When they reached the Italian mainland, the terrain became even more unforgiving. The Battle of Ortona in December 1943 pushed Canadian infantry into an urban environment filled with mines, snipers, booby-trapped buildings, and elite German paratroopers. What unfolded over 8 days was a nightmarish contest of attrition that historians later compared to Stalingrad. Canadian casualties mounted relentlessly. Nearly a quarter of the attacking battalions were killed or wounded, but the troops did not break. Instead, they invented the mouse-holing tactic, blasting holes between adjacent buildings to avoid exposed streets, allowing them to bypass fortified guns and close with German defenders at close range. German officers wrote in their diaries that Canadian troops fought with a grim determination that made them exceedingly difficult to dislodge. By the time the Canadians left Italy for Normandy, they had forged an identity distinct from both British and American forces: patient yet aggressive, methodical yet flexible, relentless under pressure yet capable of innovation under fire. Every man who landed on Juno Beach in June 1944 carried the lessons of Sicily and Ortona within him, and it showed in the momentum the Canadians displayed as they pushed inland, breaking through positions that German planners believed would repel any assault. The next phase of their journey, the battle for the Scheldt Estuary, would prove to be one of the most grueling campaigns undertaken by any Allied army in the West. After the successful breakout from Normandy and the liberation of much of France and Belgium, the Allies faced a critical logistical crisis. The port of Antwerp, one of the largest in Europe, had fallen into Allied hands intact, but the waterway leading to it, the Scheldt Estuary, remained under German control. German artillery, coastal batteries, levee positions, and fortified islands blocked Allied shipping, making the port useless. For the Allied armies advancing into the Low Countries and preparing for final assaults into Germany, opening Antwerp was essential. The task fell to the Canadians. German intelligence officers again underestimated them, believing the flooded, swampy terrain would neutralize any offensive. The German 15th Army, though battered, still held strong defensive positions along the dikes and causeways, with machine gun nests, mines, and artillery zeroed in on all approaches. What followed was a month-long ordeal so brutal that seasoned Wehrmacht officers later described it as a battle of extermination. The Canadians advanced through waist-deep mud across waterlogged polders, under constant artillery fire, while German defenders used every inch of terrain to their advantage. Storm boats and amphibious vehicles became essential, as traditional armor and trucks could not traverse the flooded flats. Engineers worked day and night to breach levees, construct makeshift bridges, and ferry troops and supplies across inundated terrain. Casualties soared. Entire Canadian battalions were reduced to half strength within days. But the Canadians pressed on, clearing village after village, fighting across narrow dikes where a single machine gun could pin down entire companies. German defenders were stunned by the persistence of the Canadian assaults. In some sectors, Canadian units fought for 12 hours straight through knee-deep water, only to continue advancing after nightfall. Engineers dove underwater to clear mines. Infantry assaulted fortified positions without armored support, relying on artillery and close air support to break open resistance. In multiple battles, Canadians crossed canals under direct small arms and mortar fire, improvised rafts when equipment was destroyed, and repeatedly outflanked German strongpoints through sheer determination. One of the defining moments of the campaign was the assault on Walcheren Island, which controlled the final approaches to Antwerp. Canadian and British engineers deliberately breached dikes to flood the island, isolating German positions. Amphibious landings, paratrooper drops, and coordinated assaults followed. Fighting was house to house, street to street, as Canadian and British units annihilated the last German defensive pockets. When the island finally fell, German survivors marveled at the discipline and tenacity of the Canadian attacks. The Scheldt had cost the Canadians more than 6,300 casualties, but it opened the port of Antwerp, arguably one of the most strategically important Allied victories of the Western Front. German assessments afterward were brutally honest. Wehrmacht diaries from the Scheldt described Canadian troops as unbreakable infantry, dreadfully persistent, and far stronger than British intelligence suggested. For the first time, German analysts began acknowledging that the Canadians had become one of the Allies' premier assault forces. The perception shift was stark. What had once been dismissed as a small army was now recognized as a decisive strategic asset, capable of executing complex operations under appalling conditions. And yet, the Canadians were not finished. As the Scheldt campaign concluded, and Antwerp finally opened to Allied shipping in November 1944, the strategic significance of the Canadian victory began to reveal itself across the entire European theater. Supplies that had previously been trucked hundreds of kilometers from France could now be unloaded directly at a major deep-water port, fueling Montgomery's 21st Army Group and allowing the Allied advance into Germany to regain momentum after months of logistical paralysis. Yet even as the world celebrated the achievement, the Canadian Army, exhausted, bloodied, and reduced by attrition, did not rest. They were immediately tasked with clearing the Maas River approaches, pushing toward the Rhine, and preparing for the final push into the heart of Germany. Time and time again, when the Allies faced terrain deemed impenetrable or objectives others could not take, the responsibility fell to the Canadians. German High Command, which once dismissed these divisions as colonial auxiliaries, now recognized them as some of the most capable assault troops on the Western Front. And this recognition was not born of propaganda, but of hard battlefield experience. After the Scheldt, German attention turned to the reinforced Canadian positions along the Maas River. Wehrmacht intelligence reports described them as disciplined, systematic, patient, and lethal when attacking, but equally immovable when defending. These assessments were echoed by German division commanders who warned that Canadian formations had become frontline specialists, whose presence in any sector signaled an impending offensive. This newfound German respect, mingled with fear, was rooted not in a single battle, but in the consistent pattern of Canadian performance across the war. From the urban carnage of Ortona to the amphibious slaughter of the Scheldt, from the brutal hedgerow battles of Normandy to the grinding advance toward Caen, the Canadians displayed a combination of planning discipline, combat aggression, and tactical innovation rarely matched by other Allied units. To understand how these troops became so formidable by 1944, it is important to revisit their strategic buildup. Canada's training infrastructure was engineered not merely to produce soldiers, but to produce specialists at every level. Engineers who could build bridges under fire, artillerymen capable of rapid and precise fire missions, armored crews trained for both breakthrough operations and infantry support, and logistics personnel capable of sustaining entire divisions across vast distances. Canadian units integrated artillery, armor, and infantry in ways that mirrored but did not simply copy British doctrine. They adapted combined arms operations to the realities of terrain, weather, and enemy force composition. This adaptability would become crucial during the winter of 1944-45 as the Canadians faced increasingly desperate German defensive lines along the Rhine frontier. The end of 1944 marked a dramatic shift in Germany's attitude toward the Canadian Army. After the shock of the Scheldt, the Wehrmacht no longer underestimated them. Instead, German commanders began preparing defenses specifically tailored to counter Canadian operational patterns. The Germans identified an alarming tendency. Canadians rarely broke off an attack once committed. Even after suffering heavy casualties, Canadian battalions often regrouped within hours and launched renewed assaults, relying on engineer support and artillery coordination to pry open even the toughest defensive positions. German prisoners reported that Canadian attacks felt inevitable, relentless, and professionally orchestrated, unlike some Allied assaults that faltered due to lack of coordination or insufficient preparation. One of the defining traits of Canadian operations was their engineering prowess. During the advance from the Maas to the Rhine, Canadian engineers rebuilt roads under artillery fire, constructed pontoon bridges across freezing rivers, cleared minefields faster than any other Allied unit in the region, and used specialized equipment developed after Dieppe to overcome obstacles the Germans believed impassable. The ability of Canadian engineers to restore mobility in ruined landscapes earned them the admiration of Allied commanders and the dread of German defenders. Many Wehrmacht reports from early 1945 complained that the Canadians advance even where terrain forbids it, describing their progress across waterlogged ground, muddy dikes, and demolished bridges in language that conveyed both shock and resignation. As winter deepened and the Battle of the Bulge erupted to the south, the Canadians held their lines along the northern flank of the Allied front, preventing German reinforcements from maneuvering toward the Ardennes. Though not the primary participants in the Bulge, their role was essential. By denying the Germans mobility in the north, They helped contain the offensive and set the stage for the Allied counterattack. When the German offensive failed, attention shifted back to the Rhine, where Canadian forces prepared for Operation Veritable, the largest single attack mounted by Canadian forces during the war. Operation Veritable, launched in February 1945, was another nightmare battlefield akin to the Scheldt. The Germans deliberately flooded the area between the Maas and the Rhine, turning forests into swamps and roads into rivers of mud. Artillery batteries sank into the earth, tanks bogged down within minutes, and infantry slogged through freezing water under mortars and machine gun fire. But once again, the Canadians pressed forward, supported by some of the heaviest artillery concentrations of the Western Front. Field guns, medium artillery and heavy weapons fired tens of thousands of rounds in carefully coordinated fire plans designed to crack German resistance. Canadian infantry advanced mile by mile, clearing fortified farmhouses, smashed villages, and dense forests filled with mines and ambushes. German defenders were stunned by the tenacity of the assault. By the end of the operation, the Canadian forces had defeated multiple German divisions, captured key terrain, and opened the northern route to the Rhine. German diaries from the period reveal a tone of despair when describing the Canadians. One officer wrote, "They fight like men who feel nothing can stop them." Another noted, "We underestimated them once. We will not survive if we underestimate them again." The image of Canada as a minor auxiliary was now completely shattered. In its place stood an army that had proven itself in every major environment: urban, amphibious, forest, swamp, farmland, and fortified defensive belts. As March 1945 approached, the Canadians prepared for one of the final major operations of the war: the crossing of the Rhine and the liberation of the Netherlands. Here again, they confronted not only German resistance but also humanitarian catastrophe. The Dutch population was starving after months of German occupation and the Hunger Winter blockade. Canadian units were tasked not only with defeating German forces, but also with delivering food, medical aid, and relief supplies to millions. Their campaign in the Netherlands combined military precision with humanitarian urgency, earning lasting gratitude from the Dutch people. Even as they faced German rearguard actions, sniper fire, and booby-trapped towns, Canadian troops organized food drops, cleared supply routes, and ensured the rapid distribution of life-saving provisions. This final phase of the war further cemented the Canadian legacy. As the Allies closed in on Germany from all directions, the Canadians continued their advance, liberating Dutch towns one after another, securing strategic bridges, and capturing German strongpoints. By the time the German surrender arrived in May 1945, the Canadian Army had grown from a tiny, underestimated force into one of the most respected military formations in the Allied world. German commanders' catastrophic misjudgments. What they had viewed as a small, inexperienced auxiliary turned out to be one of the most effective assault armies on the Western Front. An army that had overcome the Atlantic Wall, shattered elite German divisions in Italy and Normandy, crushed the 15th Army in the Scheldt, and pushed relentlessly into the heart of occupied Europe. Their reputation for endurance, engineering skill, artillery precision, and infantry aggression became legendary, and their contribution to the Allied victory remains. One of the MOA's Canadian forces advanced deeper into the Netherlands. In the spring of 1945, German commanders faced an unavoidable truth. Their earlier perception of the Canadian Army as a small, inexperienced auxiliary had been one of the most disastrous miscalculations of the war. Across every major front where Canadian forces had engaged, Ortona's shattered ruins, the hedgerows of Normandy, the flooded hell of the Scheldt, the forests of the Reichswald, and the dying Dutch towns emptying under starvation, German units repeatedly found themselves outmaneuvered, outlasted, and overwhelmed by an army whose effectiveness defied its size. Yet the story of Canada's ascendance is not just one of battlefield victories. It is also the story of logistics, discipline, leadership, and the psychological shock that rippled through the Wehrmacht as they confronted an enemy they had never prepared to fight. The Canadian Army's integration of engineering, artillery, armor, and infantry was now so advanced that German defenders often misidentified them as elite British formations or assumed they were American units supported by unusually strong engineering contingents. But these were not misidentifications based on accidental similarities. They were admissions, subtle, reluctant, and often recorded only in private diaries, that the Canadians had become one of the most reliable assault armies on the Western Front. During the advance across the northern Netherlands, the Germans attempted multiple rearguard actions to delay the Allied pursuit. Yet Canadian divisions continued to demonstrate an ability to break through seemingly impregnable defensive positions with speed and precision. For example, during operations near Groningen, Canadian troops fought their way through a heavily fortified urban environment, clearing streets and buildings while trying to minimize civilian casualties. German troops, entrenched in strongpoints and supported by well-positioned machine guns, expected the battle to unfold over several days. Instead, the Canadians dismantled the defenses block by block, using tactics refined since Ortona, mouse-holing, combined arms-breaching techniques and synchronized infantry armor advances. Their speed caught the defenders off guard, and the city fell far more quickly than German intelligence predicted. As the Canadians liberated Dutch town after town, something remarkable occurred. German formations began surrendering more frequently when facing Canadian units. Reports from the Canadian Army's intelligence branch revealed that German morale dropped sharply when soldiers learned they were positioned against Canadian forces. Wehrmacht officers frequently described Canadians as impossible to stop once they commit, and some even advised retreat in sectors where Canadian divisions prepared for an offensive. This was a complete reversal from the early years of the war, when German officers scarcely acknowledged Canada's presence on the battlefield. Now they viewed Canadian formations as elite shock troops, comparable to the best Allied units. Meanwhile, Canadian engineers continued to play a decisive role. In April 1945, during operations around the Isle River, Canadian bridging units constructed pontoon bridges under artillery fire, enabling armored and infantry formations to cross rapidly and outflank German defenses. The speed with which these structures were assembled, sometimes in less than 24 hours, astonished German combat engineers who, lacking resources and facing constant bombardment, struggled to maintain even basic infrastructure. German engineers, who once believed themselves unmatched in Europe, found themselves outperformed by Canadian counterparts who combined British doctrine, American equipment, and uniquely Canadian improvisation in the face of impossible terrain. Artillery coordination remained a Canadian hallmark. During the closing battles in the Netherlands, Canadian artillery units often executed complex fire missions within minutes, striking German strongpoints, neutralizing machine gun nests, and providing devastating counter-battery fire whenever German guns attempted to disrupt the Canadian advance. German prisoners frequently said that Canadian artillery was immediate, accurate, and relentless, a stark contrast to the early war belief that Canada possessed only light, outdated equipment. One of the most powerful examples of Canadian operational sophistication came during the liberation of Sfola. Two members of the Canadian Army, Lieutenant Colonel Donald Worthington and Major Leo Heaps, planned a daring nighttime infiltration to persuade the German garrison to withdraw without a major urban battle. The psychological gamble succeeded, and the Germans evacuated the city, sparing thousands of civilians. German officers later admitted that fear of annihilation by Canadian forces contributed to the sudden withdrawal. By this stage of the war, psychological shock had become as potent as artillery. As Canadian forces swept northward, they confronted remnants of German units retreating toward the Frisian Islands and the North Sea. Many German formations were starving, exhausted, and isolated, yet pockets of fanatical resistance remained, particularly among SS units and naval shore detachments. In these final engagements, Canadian troops launched aggressive assaults to neutralize strongpoints even as the war's end approached. Their willingness to push forward until the very last days impressed Allied leaders and confounded German defenders who expected the Canadians to adopt a more cautious posture. But caution was rarely part of the Canadian approach. They fought with a sense of purpose shaped by years of sacrifice, from Hong Kong's tragedy to Dieppe bloodbath, from Ortona's shattered streets to the drowning mud of the Scheldt. The psychological shift within the Wehrmacht was now complete. Diaries from German officers in April 1945 described Canadian troops as elite, unbreakable, and fearsome in assault. This language stood in stark contrast to earlier descriptions of Canadians as colonial auxiliaries, or light infantry of limited capability. What had changed was not merely German perception, but the entire trajectory of the war. The Canadians were no longer an underestimated force. they had become one of the primary engines of Allied victory in Northwest Europe. Meanwhile, across liberated Dutch cities, Canadian soldiers were greeted as saviors. The Dutch population, suffering from the horrors of the hunger winter, received food, medical supplies, and aid from Canadian units who shifted seamlessly from combat operations to humanitarian relief. German soldiers observed these scenes with a mixture of bitterness and resignation. The Wehrmacht, once proud of its discipline and professional ethos, had become synonymous with destruction and suffering, while the Canadians embodied liberation and compassion. The symbolic power of this contrast was enormous. Even German civilians who later encountered Canadian troops remarked on their discipline and restraint, a stark departure from the brutality they associated with occupation forces from the East. As the final pockets of German resistance collapsed and surrender terms loomed, Canadian forces continued clearing coastal regions, disarming isolated German units and stabilizing newly liberated areas. The war in Europe formally ended on May 8, 1945, but for the Canadians, the victory carried a deeper resonance. They had proven themselves on every major front where they fought, from the mountains of Italy to the beaches of Normandy, from the bogs of the Scheldt to the forests along the Rhine. They had faced some of the best German formations, the Fallschirmjäger, the 12th SS Panzer Division, the 15th Army, and multiple Wehrmacht infantry divisions, and had defeated them through discipline, innovation, courage, and the quiet determination that had defined the Canadian military identity since 1939. What began as a small army had become a decisive force. What Germany once mocked had become the spearhead of liberation. And what the Wehrmacht initially ignored ultimately played a critical role in breaking the Atlantic Wall, opening Antwerp, and driving the Germans from the Netherlands. The story of Canada in World War II is not simply one of unexpected strength. It is one of transformation, resolve, and the costly lessons of underestimation that reshaped the European battlefield. As the guns finally fell silent across Europe in May 1945, the Canadian Army stood at a place no German commander in 1939 could have imagined. Victorious, respected, and credited with some of the most decisive operations on the Western Front. The transformation from a modest, largely symbolic force into one of the Allies' premier assault armies was not the result of any single moment, but of a relentless series of campaigns that forged its identity through hardship, innovation, sacrifice, and unwavering determination. When historians trace Canada's rise, they often point to the climactic battles, the deepest penetration at Juno Beach on D-Day, the hellish street fighting in Ortona's shattered ruins, the amphibious nightmare of the Scheldt Estuary, and the sweeping liberation of the Netherlands. Yet the truth runs deeper. Canada's strength lay not just in battlefield performance, but in the fusion of training, logistics, engineering, leadership, and national resolve that allowed a small army to punch far above its weight and break some of the Wehrmacht's most fortified positions. This is why Germany's miscalculation became one of its most costly. In the aftermath of the war, captured German officers were asked to describe their impressions of various Allied armies. Over and over, they expressed surprise, sometimes shock, at the capability of Canadian forces. General Kurt Meyer of the 12th SS Panzer Division, one of the most feared units in Normandy, wrote that Canadian infantry fought with a ferocity and determination equal to any soldier on the Western Front, a comment that stunned those who believed German elites viewed only the British and Americans with respect. Other Wehrmacht diaries recovered after the war described Canadian units as thoroughly trained, expert in engineering, relentless in attack, and masters of river crossings. This shift in German perception was not merely academic. It helped reveal how deeply the Canadians had penetrated the psyche of their adversaries. They had, through sheer consistency, become an army Germany could neither predict nor stop. Canadian artillery, often overshadowed by British and American firepower in historical narratives, played a massive role in shaping this reputation. Their barrages were described by German prisoners as immediate death from nowhere, unbelievably precise, and perfectly coordinated. During the advance through the Netherlands and into Germany, Canadian gunners executed timed concentrations, counter-battery strikes, smoke screens, creeping barrages, and interlocking fire plans with a professionalism that expanded on British doctrine and often exceeded it in battlefield adaptability. This artillery proficiency, combined with infantry aggression and engineering excellence, made Canadian divisions uniquely suited to the toughest operations of 1944-45. Terrain denial assaults, waterlogged offensives, urban clearing, and close support fire missions under difficult weather. These were exactly the kinds of battles that exhausted German troops and broke formations that could not adapt. As the Canadians moved deeper into Western Europe, the German High Command documented a phenomenon they had underestimated. Canada's military was not a random assortment of volunteers, it was an integrated national mobilization. The war economy in Canada had shifted dramatically by 1944, producing armored vehicles, artillery pieces, ships, aircraft components, radios, uniforms, and ammunition in quantities that supported not only Canadian forces but also Britain and other allies. Factories in Ontario, Quebec, and the Prairie provinces churned out thousands of military vehicles, while Canadian shipyards produced corvettes essential to the Battle of the Atlantic. This industrial power was one of the reasons Canada could maintain its divisions in the field long after other nations' manpower pools and supply chains were strained to breaking. Germany, which had never taken Canadian industry seriously, paid for this oversight every time Canadian troops, fully supplied, well-equipped, and reinforced, appeared on the front lines with undiminished strength. The iconic liberation of the Netherlands remains one of the most enduring symbols of Canada's wartime legacy. German defenders, often cut off and starving themselves, fought bitterly to hold Dutch towns and prevent Allied use of key water routes and bridges. But while the Canadians fought with their usual aggression on the battlefield, they also demonstrated a humanitarian mission unique among the major Allied armies. Even while combat operations continued, Canadian troops coordinated food drops, secured supply corridors, and escorted relief convoys to starving civilians trapped in cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Utrecht. Photographs and eyewitness accounts from Dutch civilians describe Canadian soldiers sharing their rations, offering medical assistance, and working around the clock to restore electricity, water, and food distribution networks. This combination of military might and humanitarian compassion became a defining aspect of Canada's reputation in Europe. It was something German soldiers and civilians noticed too. Many German accounts from the final weeks of the war contrast the discipline and fairness of Canadian troops with the brutality they expected from enemy forces. The Canadians treated civilians, even German civilians, with humanity, reinforcing the perception that this was an army of professionalism, not vengeance. The psychological collapse of the German myth about Canada's small army was reflected in interviews and interrogations conducted after the war. Officers of the German 15th Army, whose defense of the Scheldt Estuary had cost them thousands of casualties, admitted they were unprepared for the scale and persistence of the Canadian offensive. They believed the flooded terrain was impassable, and that the mud, water, and German artillery would break any assault. Instead, they watched Canadian units advance through conditions German doctrine deemed suicidal. They came through the water as if it were solid ground, one German officer wrote. We had not imagined they possessed such endurance. Another commander noted, they crossed where armored vehicles could not move, where artillery could not be brought forward, and where reinforcements could not reach us. They fought us everywhere at once. These reflections paint a picture not just of tactical success, but of a psychological enemy, an adversary Germany could no longer deny or diminish. Meanwhile, within Canada, the war had fundamentally transformed the nation's identity. What began as a modest expeditionary contribution evolved into a national effort that touched every home, every town, and every industry. By war's end, more than 1 million Canadians had served in uniform, proportionally one of the largest mobilizations in the Allied world. The memory of the sacrifices, the victories, the losses, and the humanitarian triumphs shaped Canada's post-war diplomacy, its role in NATO, and its global reputation as a reliable partner in peacekeeping and international security. German miscalculations had revealed a deeper truth. Canada's strength was hidden not in imperial labels or outdated intelligence, but in the resolve of its citizens and the adaptability of its institutions. The symbolic closing chapter of Canada's European campaign came with the formal surrender of German forces in the Netherlands on May 5, 1945. Canadian Lieutenant General Charles Foulkes accepted the surrender from German General Johannes Blaskowitz in Wageningen. The moment encapsulated the entire journey, from dismissal and underestimation to recognition and respect. German officers present during the surrender noted the discipline, professionalism, and quiet resolve of the Canadian soldiers around them. They saw not an auxiliary force, but a victorious army that had earned its place among the great military formations of the world. And so the final truth emerges clearly. Germany's underestimation of Canada's small army became one of its most consequential strategic errors. The Canadians broke through the Atlantic Wall on Juno Beach, fought with ferocity in Italy, crushed the 15th Army in the Scheldt, liberated the Netherlands, and helped open the route to Germany itself. They mastered terrain no one else could cross, adapted tactics no one else imagined, and carried a moral weight that influenced the hearts of civilians and the fears of their enemies. What began as a dismissive remark in German intelligence circles became, by 1945, an admission written across defeat. Canada had proven not only that it could fight, but that it could win, endure, liberate, and transform the course of the war.